In terms of attachments, I do want to call out the authorizing resolution because there will be a change this year. So in the past, transit systems have indicated specific programs in their authorizing resolution, but because you don't know what programs may be funding your projects this year. That won't be something that you know until contract time. You will just reference all programs. So this is just example language. Some people have their own resolutions that they use, and that's totally fine. We do provide a sample, but it doesn't have to be used. But this is just sample language of where you could make adjustments to make sure that you are getting a resolution for any and all programs administered by our office. So I did just want to point that out because that is kind of a departure from past processes. The E&D program. So a note here, this primarily applies to rural systems. Urban systems do get E&D, some of them anyway, and you still are eligible for E&D, and you will be factored in like you always have been. The reason I'm calling this out specifically is because we have added additional rural transit systems to the program since E&D was created, and there has not really been an opportunity in the past for them to be to request reimbursement for their half fares because they were not in the original formula. So because of that, we are asking in the application if you offer a half fare, and then if you do, you will be able to answer questions associated with the E&D program to determine if you're eligible to receive reimbursement. If you are, then you will be factored in to the formula, and your statistics will be considered once we are going through and making awards under that program in the fall. We did include this in that letter of intent. There was only 3 systems that actually submitted the information because there was actually a technical error in the LOI. So because of that, that's why we're including it in the application this year. But in the future, we fixed the LOI, so it shouldn't be a problem. In the future, you can just enter this information in the LOI and you won't have to do it again in the application. But for those 3 systems that did actually submit it in the LOI, we are requesting that you go ahead and do it again in the application. I apologize for that, but if you could go ahead and also complete it in the application so we have all the information in one spot, that would be greatly appreciated. I do apologize for any inconvenience on that technical error that we experienced this year. Okay, so that's kind of what general information about what to expect in the application this year. So I do want to highlight some things to consider as you're going through your application and completing some of that information. And some of these examples might not apply to you based on the projects you're applying for, but bear with me. The first thing that I want to highlight is budget narratives. So this primarily applies to rural transit systems. For urban transit systems, we don't ask you to go into detail on this, and that is because you're not getting federal awards. But if you are a urban system that is seeking funding for rural public transit, you will be requested to do this. So just bear that in mind. So the budget narratives have been really hit or miss in terms of, effectiveness. And I want to take a second to explain why the budget narratives are so important and why they really require your attention and effort to do correctly. So budget narratives are the meat and potatoes of our process for determining allowability of costs. As you know, we do not ask you to submit supporting documentation with your invoices for reimbursement. We are relying on approving your budgets at the time of award and then reviewing your project cost reports and then reviewing your finances under the technical assistance review in order to limit your effort in getting reimbursement. But in order to do that with some level of, confidence, I suppose, we need to make sure that we feel confident in the budget we're approving up front. So when we're asking you to do budget narratives, we're asking you to say, okay, you say that you need $100,000 for salaries and wages. You had to come up with that number somehow, right? So explain that to us. What makes up that number? Because one, we want to determine allowability of cost, meaning you're not including someone's salary in there that's not eligible. But two, we want to make sure it's reasonable. So if you're like, I'm just going to put $100,000 in because that makes me feel secure, but really we're probably only going to draw down $50,000, we can't do that, on our end. And people will begin to get penalized for that, moving forward, because what that does to us is we put a bunch of money in federal grants that are never going to get drawn down, and all that does is extend our grant life and makes it harder on us. So we really are going to be cracking down on that and making sure that budgets are not only allowable, but reasonable. So I want to kind of give some examples of budget narratives in the past that have been submitted and kind of what not to do and what we're kind of expecting. So this is an example of a budget narrative that was submitted, and they provided their estimate amount, and then this was the justification. So they needed that much money for operators, salaries, and wages, and their justification is it's based on projected needs. Does that help us determine allowability? Does that help us know that this is reasonable? No. So this would not be acceptable. We would come back to this applicant and say, we cannot approve this project based on this information. We have no idea how you're coming up with these numbers. So we in good conscience cannot accept this. No, bad. Okay. This is another example. This is better, right? We're getting a little bit more information. We have 41 part-time operators, 2 full-time lead operators. That's what makes up this $1 million budget. It's better, it lets us know kind of generally what is being applied for, but it doesn't give us, rates. It doesn't give us things like that, director, assistant director, clerical assistants. Is the director full-time? Is the assistant full-time? Is the clerical assistant full-time? Are you allocating a certain percentage of their funds? We don't know. Should we expect a cost allocation plan? Should we be looking for guidance too for indirect costs? We don't know. This still doesn't kind of tell us, are they direct costs, indirect costs? It gives us a general idea of what they are, but not really how they're applied. So still not quite there. But this one goes into a lot more detail, right? So we have this many hours, this many full-time drivers, this many part-time drivers. Here's the average rate we're looking at. The salaries are based on wages and then a raise increase. And then you can't see it, but they also, because it's a scrolling screen, but they also included hours for like administrative staff. So this gets us a lot closer to, okay, this is what's included. This is how they're coming up with it. This is how the staff is being applied. And this is just labor examples. But then you talk about advertising fees and things like that, just saying advertising, is it a website? Is it newspapers? Like, what is going into this? Because for example, things like meals, cost of meals, right, isn't eligible. So if you have a travel budget and you have meals that you're factoring in there, if you outline that in your narrative, we could come back to you and say, hey, looks great, except we're going to have to adjust it and reduce your award because meals aren't eligible. Because the other part of this is, if you're charging ineligible things, it's going to come out. you know, in your technical assistance review, when we're coming in and doing a deep dive on your financials, and now you're in a payback situation. So by being forthcoming in this application and by being detailed, you're not only helping us, but at the end of the day, you know, you're helping you, because we're making sure that you're being set up to be successful and do this in a compliant way. So this is what we're much closer to what we're looking for. Okay, so I want to provide some scalability examples that we saw in the last application cycle. And these are related to OTP2, but I thought that they were good examples of how you might outline how the scope was changed in a scalable project. So this entity originally requested $100,000 for this project. When we asked them if it was scalable, they said it was, and that their minimum amount of funding available would be $20,000. And when we asked them how the scope would change, they let us know, you know, basically if we only get 20,000, we are just going to fund fewer shelters. So we knew, like, okay, you know, we could fund between 20 and 100,000, and you know, based on whatever we give them in that range, we'll just be, okay, we're going to do this many instead of what we originally requested. So that kind of gave us a good idea of the impacts to them if we were to scale their project down. The next example is they requested $300,000, but said, you know, we could go as low as 150,000. And if we get less, you know, initially we're saying, hey, we're applying for a project to completely replace our parking lot. And the lower the project goes, you know, we're going to have to approach it different, meaning we're either going to have to repair one side or the other. We're going to have to do concrete instead of asphalt, or, you know, these are some different scenarios we would consider if you scaled our project back. So that really gave us a good idea of, you know, what we could expect in terms of the project quality should we have to award less than they're originally requesting. But there was some bad examples of just, you know, we said, is it scalable? And they said yes. And then their justification was, we really need this funding for this project to happen. So then it's not scalable, or it is, right? If it's not scalable, if you really need that money, all of it, in order to really effectively deliver the project, don't say it's scalable. It's not. If you say it's not, it doesn't mean that the project's not going to be funded or is going to be scored lower. It just really helps us make sure that we can spread that dollar as far as we can.